On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Jesse Lehmier. He is the data engineering manager at ASAPP. We've got a couple of topics that we're going to run through. Jesse's had a great career and trajectory into management. We're going to touch on what skills he had to pick up along the way and kind of the movement and pivoting, what more you have to do once you become a manager, taking ownership, getting involved outside of hiring if you're an IC. We got a whole lot of stuff. I think we're going to try to jam pack as much as we can. If we miss something, heck, we're going to have Jesse come back for a second podcast episode. But I appreciate you doing this, Jesse. Thanks for being on.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So I obviously did not do justice to who you are. I always like to have my guests give the audience a little bit of intro in terms of who they are and how they got here, and then we'll get going from there.
Yeah, sure. So just a little bit about ASAPP. ASAPP is an artificial intelligence company that's focused on improving customer experiences. For example, using NLP to drive efficiencies in customer care. And I'm managing the data engineering team focused on analytics. So we're building the ETLs and the data warehouse that helps facilitate analysis for both our external customers and internal stakeholders. A little bit about my background. I started out as a full stack software engineer. I did that for several years and then moved into analytics and big data, and slowly moved into a leadership role in that group. And I joined ASAPP in 2018 as a data engineer, very quickly took on some managerial responsibilities. And I have a bachelor's and master's in computer science from Rochester Institute of Technology.
Awesome. Yeah, and along the way, I mean, you've from graduating with your master's degree, going into Yahoo and then Verizon to ASAPP, quickly have made a trajectory into management. You've been a manager now for a little bit, a lead before that. I guess let's talk a little bit about, that process, right? So did you want to get into management quickly? Was that a goal or did that just happen to come about and you took advantage of the opportunities?
It was a little bit of both. I think it was in the back of my mind that I wanted to try it at some point. And I had been going down that path kind of unknowingly in my time at Yahoo. I was kind of developing a lot of these skills and I was taking on a lot of leadership responsibilities. I didn't have direct reports necessarily, but I was doing some of these things at the time. And when I came in to ASAPP, like I said, I came in as an IC and we had started building out this kind of a new project that I was leading. And it just kind of was a natural progression. There was an opportunity. I thought it was a good one to take. And so I took it.
I guess when it comes to, the opportunity was there, you took it. What were some of the, I guess, precursor skills that you were looking to develop, right? So if you, are thinking in the back of your mind, I'd like to be a manager, that's kind of something that I'm going to orient myself to, the right trajectory. What did you start doing during your IC days to kind of get yourself, I guess the right skill set, the people side, whatever you needed to kind of ramp up on?
Yeah, sure. I think the very big one that's really important was the ownership side. And you mentioned taking ownership. And initially, I think that's pretty natural for engineers to have some kind of technical ownership, especially senior engineers. But when I first kind of got into data, there was a project that I was really asked to help out on. And it was really just me. It was taken off of my team, put into this project. And it was just something that was kind of given to me. And I decided to own it and say, I think I can take the lead on this. I don't really know exactly what this entails, but I'm willing to try it out. And then over time, that kind of grew into becoming more senior in that team.
Just to touch on some of the skills that, obviously you saw the opportunity, taking a little bit more ownership, some of the soft skills that you have to pick up along the way and kind of start, having different views of people in terms of, being a leader. Where did some of the soft skills come up? Because I think that's, if you're always being, focused on the technical side and you're always, driving those discussions, you have to find some opportunity to kind of develop some of those other skills.
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. I think that it was really helpful being in analytics. I think that's a great kind of intermediate point where you're in a technical role. You're working with instructor and platform engineering, but then you're also building this very kind of business oriented product. Like the final output is this set of tables, this warehouse that business and product managers are going to use to derive some insights. I found it's very cross-functional, especially when I started, where I had to go and meet with a lot of different people from different backgrounds within the organization and then kind of tailor the conversation to whom I was speaking with. And so just doing that in previous roles really helped, I think, develop some of those communication skills early on.
That's, I think, some of the soft skills that you go to school, you have a bachelor's degree in computer science. Technically, you've had those skills sharpened, and then as you're progressing the ladder, you need to start picking up other skills. And you touched on ownership, right? And you touched on before, as a lead or senior IC, you're responsible for technical leadership, technical ideas, initiatives. So all of a sudden you flip on the manager hat, right? And all of a sudden now it's no longer, hey, the team has to deliver the technical solution, but you're responsible for a whole slew of other things. What were some of those things that you were starting to see pop up that maybe you weren't as understanding of when you were more of a technical IC?
Oh, sure. I think like the big one is managing the dependencies between the different deliverables. So you'll end up owning really like a project roadmap. So what is this product? Like, here's what we have now, what you've built now, but we're going to build a team around it. And now you have deliverables that are coming out at the end of the month, at the end of the quarter, and there's expectations of customers who want to use this thing. So you have the roadmap being like, what is the timeline for these deliverables, and then the dependencies. Who do I need to work with to get them done? That might not be totally clear just from the IC perspective. At least I had been missing some of that. I think there's still a lot of things that you can do on the IC side to get like more involved in that area. And I kind of realized that there were a couple things I had done in a past role, kind of unknowingly, that really helped with this, that kind of turned this into a skill that I now have more confidence in.
So I guess talking about maybe some specifics, I think that I always like getting a little bit more granular in terms of maybe the first time that you had to sit down with the product team and collaborate. Is there any instance that you recall where you're sitting there and it's kind of some challenges you're trying to solve that previously in an IC role somebody else was taking on? I mean, is there anything that kind of stands out?
Well, I remember thinking back in a previous role, I remember working on a project where it was something that we were kind of working on as a side project, actually, with the product manager. So it was something that product was kind of leading that vision, and I was more like the technical lead.
Hmm.
And we kind of did this like I said, as a side project. We thought it would show some value. So it was really building a new ETL that would help facilitate analytics a little bit more streamlined. It was something that was kind of cumbersome to do in the current design. And it wasn't really clear how to get to that end solution from the problem statement, from the initial product design. So I thought it was an interesting problem to kind of tackle, from the engineering. And once we were able to prove that this had some value, and we kind of brought that to management and were able to get it into a project, then suddenly I was kind of the lead of this project and was getting resources dedicated to it, and now had to be responsible for what those engineers were working on, and kind of managing like an even bigger scope. So it kind of grew from there. Those are kind of the things that, like, getting into I think the big picture stuff. So it's like really from the engineering side, I guess I was much more in the details. Like, how am I going to actually build this thing? And now there's this really high level picture that I have to help drive. And I think that could certainly be challenging. I think it was for me.
I think that's interesting. I guess the notion of a side project, and all of a sudden, you're put in a position where you have to do a lot more than you previously did. Was there anybody that was your mentor during this period? Like, did you have somebody to turn to fill in some of those gaps at all?
Oh yeah. So when I joined this team, I was really new to data altogether. So the entire team was very senior and had been building this platform for many years. They even had a kind of a lead architect who was really like their kind of de facto manager. And so I had a lot of resources to help out. At this point, when we started doing this project, I was probably a few years in and had built up some of the confidence. I think that's kind of one of my main takeaways is there's certainly like being technically competent in this area that takes time. But then there's also the confidence side of believing that you can like own this larger initiative. And that took a little bit more time to get to. Also building these relationships with product. I think having a close relationship with the product manager on this initiative was really helpful because we were able to bounce ideas off each other that were not particularly technical. We could talk kind of about how would this be used, or what are some other value we can get out of this process. Yeah, I think it was a variety of mentors on both the technical and product side.
I like the concept of mentorship sometimes because I think it's not the easiest thing always to go seek help, right? And people are always wondering, what's going to be the view if I ask a question about this? So obviously, in your situation, you had people who you could turn to. And I was just curious, as a new manager, did that shape your view of how you could work with your team? And then I guess, maybe a follow up to that would be is, the makeup of the team, I guess, in terms of, junior, senior, what type of makeup you have, just kind of help some context as well.
Oh, sure. Definitely. I think that that experience really helped drive how I look at mentorship in within the team. Because when I was new, just to data, you really have to depend on the senior engineers because there's a few things coming into it. You're coming into entirely new tech stack, and also all the internal kind of institutional knowledge that's been built up. I think it's especially relevant in analytics, where you often have all these different data streams that you're trying to combine, and there's a lot of just business logic that goes into constructing a particular metric. So I think I took a lot of that experience and turned that into how I handle some of the teaching. And actually, initially, when I started building this team, we did bring in people who were from other areas of engineering. So they were kind of going through the same thing that I went through. So I was kind of able to take like what helped me get into this right away and hit the ground running because I had engineering experience. I had been a software engineer, and I think there's just a few things that you get through a couple of projects, and like I said before, getting just some confidence, just getting like that initial quick win can really help. So I think that kind of certainly framed how I looked at management and mentoring the initial team. Eventually, we did bring in some more senior people into that team. So we certainly have a great mix, I think, across the board now.
An interesting maybe thought if you could share would be is I know, obviously data engineering is requiring a lot more software development skills than before. Maybe the way data moved around 10, 15, 20 years ago was a lot more tool based, right? Specific databases each had a tool or a generic tool that could move data for you. But now it's very software engineering oriented. And obviously your background sets you up. If somebody's trying to get into data engineering, right? Let's say somebody's sitting and listening to this going, hey, I'm a software engineer. I'd like to get into data engineering. Was there anything that stands out in your background that you go, yeah, these are things that you should, gravitate towards, volunteer for, et cetera?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think the number one thing, just like get your foot in the door, is just get really good at SQL. I think that's like an easy thing because you can likely come into a data team and like learn some variation of SQL, whether it's Spark SQL or Apache Hive on Hadoop. And if you're working at like a full stack development role, I mean, I've worked in like Oracle databases and MySQL, Postgres for many years, and it's just learning a little bit of a new syntax to get into some of these other flavors. So I think that's the initial way to hit the ground running. And that's what we did when I first joined. That analytics team was really working on Hive queries on their Hadoop clusters, and then slowly moving into some of the more the software side. So I think that's kind of my first tip to just get into being able to contribute because you can really have a lot of impact, especially on analytics, just doing that.
Especially the analytics team where it's going to have a lot more business angle and focus. I think, the one thing that I hear from software engineers who've made the pivot is it's just a different set of problems than they were working on before. And I think that takes a little bit of time, especially if you're working really closely, let's say with a business unit, trying to actually figure out the analytics that they need delivered as a data engineer. That's a different twist than purely a product and feature driven type role.
Right, exactly. And I think the other side, if it were data engineering, is just really broad. Like you can say data engineering, and it's actually like my team, where we're much more focused on analytics and closer to the product and business logic. But you can be on the other side and be really just moving data around and trying to transfer large amounts of data across a network. And then maybe in that case, it might be beneficial to focus more on concurrent programming and systems engineering. And those skills would likely help you get into those types of roles. I also think it really depends on what type of data engineering role you're going for, and just keeping in mind they're not all the same.
I guess from that standpoint, when you're looking to hire now, what do you look for? I guess, obviously you'd like somebody to come in with pure data engineering skills to hit the ground running, but do you have a different view? Because obviously you can identify somebody with, the correct software fundamentals who has a desire to get in. Is that something that kind of stands out given, what you have gone through?
Yeah, I think I kind of look at it as where are we specifically hiring for? Like which area of the team needs the most support right now? And based on that, I try to tailor what we're looking for specifically. For example, if it's something that's much more on the analytics side, I might look for more like a data architecture, data modeling type of skill, where you're taking data from different sources and a particular format, transforming it, combining it, and then ultimately producing this series of metrics. And I might not really look so closely at the technology because they're going to have to come in and use what we built anyways. So I try to look at like, what have you used in the past and how will that translate into what we have? I also try to look at the growth path. I like to not just look at what do we need you to work on now, but what do we have that's going to help advance your career, and what does your like next year or two look like here?
I guess I'm curious because I mean, I think, obviously you've kind of gone through the process and you had to, the side project, taking ownership, there's things that obviously you've built on. Do you now, with let's say somebody, and maybe it hasn't happened, but if somebody who's junior that's coming into your team, are you going to maybe try to get them into taking ownership outside technical issues as they're kind of growing, just to kind of, knowing what you've had to go through in terms of your maturation?
Of course, I tailor it to the individual. So I think it's certainly a growth path. I want the engineers to take more ownership and just more steps to kind of grow their careers, I guess. I think it also depends on what they're interested in. So some of the stuff around like the project management and the roadmap, that might not be the most interesting to someone, and that might actually weigh them down. So I might try to look at what is their goal, what do they want to get out of the next step in their career. And maybe that's more like, okay, own this technically end to end and design like a bigger solution than normal. So maybe like a junior engineer might just contribute to a small part of a larger project. The next step might just be, well, here's the whole thing, and this might take a few months. And you still have to work with a lot of people. And I'll be there to support, but I want you to take the initiative to reach out and build those relationships.
I guess, going back to outside of maybe mentoring, right? Because I guess, mentoring is very proactive. Maybe talk about just your relationship with your team from a reactive. Like once you see there's an issue or that might be a problem with somebody on the team, what's your approach? Like, what are you looking for, during your one-on-ones and your stand-ups to kind of help identify that someone might need you to step in and it doesn't look like they might be asking?
I guess I try to kind of look for the big picture. So, what am I hearing from other groups, especially in data? We're working very closely with other teams. So, they're likely a partner with product engineering and then product management on that feature. And then on the data side, we have our own product leadership. And sitting in between, we have project managers who are kind of driving the work. So, I think if there's something that I'm not getting directly from the engineer, I'm kind of looking at kind of the totality of all these other groups and trying to gather feedback and trying to just get enough context on the situation. And yeah, then I think ultimately delivering that feedback is really important. Also, trying to get to the root of the problem. Maybe it's a miscommunication issue, or it could be just like a soft skill communicate, like a partnership like type thing, like relationship building, or not knowing exactly who to go to. Another thing that I always kind of bring up early on with new hires is not to spend so much time spinning wheels on something that is just really unclear, and just reach out like really early. Like it's not a bad thing to ask for help early on. And so I'd much rather somebody come to me and say they need some support on something or they're totally lost than to lose a few days on it.
Yeah, that's actually a good policy because I think that's where, yeah, the frustration and then hopefully somebody learns when to ask for help. I think a lot of times people just, I think we're afraid of not seeming like we know what we're doing, or we just don't want to bring up that there's a deficiency. And sometimes it's at our own demise at times. And I think knowing when to ask for help if no one's watching is really key.
The other thing I have to do is I like to do is just make myself available. So if there's something that comes up, like I'm always willing to find some time to have kind of like an ad hoc one-on-one and just talk through it. If there's an issue that comes up and it's not something that's really that easy to talk about over Slack. So it's just like, let's just get in a call and just work through this. And if we have to pull in some others, I can help facilitate that. So that's part of my job.
Yeah, actually, that's a good segue. I was going to ask you. So now that you lost a little bit of the maybe FaceTime, a lot more Zoom, a lot more, web based conversations. What's changed for you in terms of, running and manage a team? What have you had to adjust to be, effective?
That's a great one. I think certainly you're totally right. The big thing is not getting the FaceTime with my staff that's local. I think I started doing kind of like multiple one-on-ones a week and just like having more touch bases. And then over time, I kind of just like to tailor it to the individual, just like I said with the mentoring thing. So if somebody wants to meet for half an hour, 3 times a week, I can do that. If they want to just have a longer, like let's just talk for 45 minutes, an hour once a week, whereas maybe we've done 25 minutes to half an hour before. I could do something like that. And initially, we did kind of some working sessions where we just kind of be on the call and just try to simulate an office environment and something specific to talk about. They can jump onto their own call and mostly just sitting there and kind of working in the background. I think that's been really helpful. I think a lot of us didn't really live close to our office, so we had a lot of commuting time. I think that's actually been kind of nice is I can now get up early and give a few hours, extra hours to the company early on in the day.
I mean, this might tie in. I was going to ask you about velocity. So I haven't asked this question before, but I'm curious in your viewpoint. So, in terms of, obviously the gain in productivity of not having to commute itself might be a massive win, maybe some inefficiencies from having to be remote and adjusting. What have you seen with the team's velocity in terms of, executing, during, let's say, the initial stages, well, before, what typically was, and then right when, all this stuff hit, and then through now the last couple of months where maybe hopefully things are settling?
Yeah, for sure. I think that like certainly when things first kind of hit, things were a little shaky. We didn't really know how long this was going to last, and I think there was maybe some belief that this was going to be fairly temporary and we'd be back to the office, which certainly wasn't true. So yeah, I think like initially there was maybe a few hiccups, but I think we hit our stride again, maybe like a month or so after, and I think velocity has actually improved in my opinion. I'm seeing more pull requests coming in, more activity and discussions, and just a lot of projects moving a little bit more aggressively than normal. I mean, the other side of it is we're kind of a global company anyway, so we have teams that were already distributed. We already had experience working remotely, and even in my past job, I was in the West Coast, and I had a team out east, and I had to manage that over the time zone difference. So I think it's just been kind of part of my experience that this is somewhat normal, and that really the extra time is the biggest benefit.
That's interesting. Yeah, I always talk to people who, are outside engineering, and I'm like, if any team or group was probably most suited to picking up and just running, it was the tech and engineering side because they have a lot of experience working in these kind of diverse teams, working remotely. I think it is interesting that you guys, with a commute returning back, the flip side to this is going to be if when and if things go back to normal, whatever that normal is all of a sudden giving up that additional time that you had captured, and having to go back to maybe in office and getting on the train again and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think we'll manage it. I mean, I used to spend some of that time to catch up on messages and email. I think there's certainly things to do during that time to be productive. So I don't think it's going to be a total loss, of course, but it'll be an interesting readjustment.
I think humans are obviously adaptabilities are one of our key traits, and we've all now adapted to the current scenario. It's now become normal. People say new normal. I'm like, no, it's just the next normal, because that's what happens with everything. It's just the next thing we do becomes normal. And you get adjusted to this. At first it was foreign, and then it's going to be, all right, go back to an office. And then I bet you the first couple of days in the office, well, this is weird. I've got to drive in. I've got to, walk upstairs, take an elevator. This is so weird. And it's like, well, I did this for like, however long. And I think that's just human nature for you. I was just kind of curious, like, obviously, with your trajectory, and we've been kind of talking about the past, and we've talked about mentorship. What are you personally working on? What, in terms of skills, what are you trying to sharpen, knowing obviously you want to kind of move forward and progress your career? What are those areas that you think you should be concentrating on?
The big one for me is getting more into this project management side. I think that's been the hardest part for me, especially like owning all of the deliverables and the dependencies, and especially on like really larger projects. I've certainly leaned on having project managers in the team to do some of those. That's certainly a growth area for me. And I think the other side is also delegating more. I got this from the very beginning is you're going to have to delegate some of this IC work. And there's still things that I like technically own on the technical side. So I think getting better at letting go of those things is another area I would like to take on a larger project. I'd like to kind of see if there's other areas outside of just the analytics that we can kind of also own, like kind of grow up the team to be a little bit more dynamic. Those are some of the main things I'm looking at. I'm also just trying to grow in my management style, I guess. I get that a lot. Like, what's your style? I don't think I really have a style yet. It's still in development. And I do like to be adaptive. I like to understand what the engineers really are looking for, what's going to be the best for them. So usually when I get that, I'll ask on an interview, what are some of the skills of the best managers you've had? And just get some input from candidates. I really like learning about those kind of things.
It's just an interesting question, side topic. Learning management through osmosis. So I always talk to people in management. I'm like, well, you were trained to have the hard skill for the most part, or you developed the hard skill, and then management just kind of happened because you're, the top performer, or you gravitated towards it. Something takes you to management, but very few go back to school for it, which, obviously in theory might or might not help you depending if the management area is applicable to going to school for it, or books, or etc. It seems like osmosis is trying to steal little tips, tools from other people, kind of building your own, like you said, management style. It seems like that osmosis has been the consistent fashion for people to kind of ramp into management for the longest time.
Of course. And I mean, I've had several managers, so I was able to draw on a lot of experience of things that I thought worked from them, and kind of end up merging a lot of these different philosophies into one. And then it really depends on the organization too. That some of the things that I learned, they're just not applicable here. And so you kind of have to relearn those through experience. I think having really great leadership, like having a great manager when you're just getting into management's really helpful, and kind of leaning on like your directors and VPs at companies. I think that's also something I've done. Is even if it's something like, can we just meet and I just want to bounce some ideas off of you, even if it's another manager in a different department, like someone I don't work with directly, but I respect and know that they have a wealth of experience as well and could really help me out. It's also another opportunity to grow another business relationship. So,
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think we could probably dive into this topic for a while. I'm cognizant you've got to get back to your day. I really appreciate you being on. I think this was excellent, diving into some of the lessons learned, and hopefully someone who's, on the cusp, or maybe who's thinking about going to management, has some better ideas to kind of think about. So I appreciate you being on the podcast this week.
oh, of course, thanks for having me. This is great.
Absolutely. And if somebody wants to, contact you, talk about anything further that we've discussed, what's the best medium to get a hold of you?
Yeah, LinkedIn's great. It's just Jesse Lehmier on LinkedIn, and just mention the podcast. And if you include a question or two, I'm happy to get back to you.
Awesome. We'll include that link in the show notes. So if anyone is interested in following up with Jesse. And I guess that's it for this week. I appreciate you listening. Feel free to let us know any other topics or types of guests that you want on. We're always looking for ideas. Happy to hear those. Also, subscribe to the podcast and give us some feedback. That's really the best way to help us grow the listenership and just the content we're putting out. And until next week, we'll be back. Thank you.